We are very lucky today to have Judea Pearl here, Rabbi Abraham Cooper, Michael Barenbaum, and Stanley Goldman. Please come up to the stage and have a lively discussion.
I'm Stan Goldman. I was asked by Stephen if I would moderate, probably because I'm the one person up here who doesn't know anything on the subject, and therefore a perfect moderator. And I'd like to start by just having our panelists. I know Michael Birnbaum quite well. Obviously, I think everybody does. And perhaps we'll start with Michael, since he's the rabbi, since he's on that end of the table. May I just ask a question, if I could, and then you can speak. I would never cut Rabbi Birnbaum off. Do you think there would have been a partition without the Holocaust?
I think you're asking two different questions. Would there have been a state of Israel without the Holocaust? Yes. It would have taken a different time and a different urgency, and it would not have enjoyed the type of support that it had worldwide. Let's say a couple of things that are, let me say one thing that's a little bit impolite, but not untrue. And that is that the formation of the State of Israel by partition, number one, solved the question of refugees not going to Paris or Amsterdam or Washington or New York or Los Angeles. And consequently, there was more support to solve that problem, because the question of what are you going to do with the refugees? And that's one of the reasons that precipitated the type of support that was involved. Partition was a long idea. Partition was there from 1937. The language even of the Balfour Declaration was ambiguous. It said a Jewish home. It didn't say a Jewish state. And the reason for that was because of the enormous imbalance between the population of Jews and the population of Arabs in 1917. And consequently, if there had been a state, it would have been a very complicated matter with so few Jews living in what was then Palestine. So let's begin. Zionism would have ultimately achieved its goal, and Jewish nationalism would have been alive and well. Jewish nationalism would have been in much better shape without the Holocaust, because the reservoir of Jews who were available to come to Palestine at that point would have been much greater. And I would never want to burden Israel with being the consolation for the inconsolable, which is the Shoah. Last point, again, the partition was the idea that two states could be born in the same land. When we studied Talmud for the first time, we all learned the same Talmud. Two men are grasping a garment. This says it's all mine. The other one says it's all mine. The question is, what do you do? And partition was a solution to divide and to provide a homeland for the Jewish people, which became a state, and to also provide for an Arab state, which at that point would have not been a Palestinian state, because Jews at that point in history were Palestinians, and Palestinians were known as Arabs. Arab nationalism was shaped as a counter-response to Jewish nationalism, and when you were born, Judea, you were born as a Palestinian Jew, and there was no sense of Palestinian Arab at that point. There was only Arab. So that gives you a little bit of a historical background.
How did they envision the state then that was going to be an Arab state in the partition?
They partitioned the country into a disproportionate thing. Israel was, if we thought that Israel in 48 to 67 was thin at 9 miles, it was even thinner at that point. Jerusalem was not to be in the Jewish territories, and the boundaries of Israel would have been enormously difficult boundaries to live with. It was based on essentially the population that was present at that point, did not leave significant room for absorption, though everybody understood it was clear when the partition plan took place, it was clear that there would be a large problem of absorption of the survivors of the Holocaust. It was not quite as clear that there would be a second large absorption issue, which was the Jews of Arab lands, who were essentially thrown out and separated from the lands in which they had lived for a very long time. That was not clear as early envisioned. And let's also say one other thing, which is that the Arabs rejected partition. They rejected partition in 37, they rejected partition in 47, and Golda Meir, and partition was not a decisive or clear, overwhelming desire among the Jews. Golda Meir, for example, voted against the partition in 37, and she said, in retrospect, I'm happy that on my vote it did not fail. But in 47, there was the sense of the necessity of a state, any sort of state, because the Jewish people were desperate. And remember, the other part of it is that, and this is the one perspective of history. If you ask me what the greatest response to the Holocaust was on behalf of the Jewish people, it was the decision to remain Jews and not to give up and to reinvent themselves in a new type of articulation. Remember, the Jewish people, 1/3 had been destroyed. The only non-problematic country where Jews were living that could assume any leadership for world Jewry was then the United States. Every other country was either decimated or fighting for its life. And Jews decided to remain Jews, and they were reborn in the aftermath of a massive destruction. This is what has happened to Jewish people several times in our history. The most important 586, the important 70 of the Common Era, certainly after the Spanish Inquisition, but this was the greatest regeneration and rebirth imaginable.
Professor Pearl, do you have any thoughts on this? You were there, although very young.
Yeah, I think we should pay more attention to the Balfour Declaration, because I think without seeing the substrate of Jewish mind, okay, that was created by the Balfour Declaration, we cannot explain not only the immigration, but also the state of mind of the Jews in the state. Now, Balfour Declaration is credited with, of course, the immigration of about, let's say, from 200,000 to 550,000 in 1947. Okay. But aside from the numbers and the immigration, it changed the psyche of the Jew in the shtetl. It's one of those cases. Well, the Balfour Declaration itself is 67 words, and it sounds like a greeting card, a holiday greeting card. His Majesty government sees favorably the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So what? So what's a big deal about seeing looks favorably upon? But this is one of those Ben-Gurionic case, which means that it doesn't matter what the world thinks. What matters is what the Jews do. And that's what happened there. The Jews of the shtetl took it literally. And they said, well, it is now okay. We have not only we have international recognition, but also we have, and something which is not many people accredited the Balfour Declaration, there is a new definition of indigeneity. It's the first time in history where indigeneity is defined not by virtue of genetic linkage, nor by physical presence in a certain land, but by historical connection. And that changed the mind of my grandfather, okay, who was in 1923 was assaulted by a Polish peasant and called a dirty Jew, and he came home and said, "Start packing, we are going home." Home, because Balfour said that this is our home. And he sold his properties, and they bunched together with 26 other families, and they bought land where in Bnei Brak, that's the city where the Rabbi Akiva established his place of learning, okay, because we have been there. Okay, it's a total change of mind. It's ours, not by virtue of being physically present there, but because of our collective memories. Okay, and by the way, this also created the idea of a Palestinian state at the Balfour Declaration. Okay? Because indigeneity is not connected with whether a Palestinian had a national identity yesterday. What matters is what the kind of coherence and identity they have today, because indigeneity is a state of mind. It's not facts that makes it, but a state of mind. So I think we should also, however, credit one little step before the Balfour Declaration and the 1947, and this is a man named Arlosov. And we talked about it, and I think he should be given credit right here. Arlosov was murdered on the beach of Tel Aviv in 1933 because he was the Secretary General, I believe, of the Jewish Agency, and he signed a contract with the Nazis, with Hitler, or with Goering at that time, yeah? The agreement was that 60,000 German Jews will be allowed to come to Israel with their properties, okay, with some arrangement through the Mandate Authority, yes, and that in return for which the agency, Jewish agency, will give some, I think, some token credit. They stopped the, first of all, they would allow German merchandise to be bought in Israel by the British authority. Okay.
No, let me state it let me be a pain in the neck historian. The deal was as follows, that Jews would have to forsake all their property in Germany. They would get a percentage of the property in terms of German material that would be sent and exported to Palestine. And the deal essentially ended up being something that rescued some 60,000 Jews from Germany, which was more than 1 in 10 German Jews. And the controversy was whether you give legitimacy to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi government in 1933 when it was dealing with it. And I've said, and I would say again, that I would sign that deal despite all of my reservations of it, because essentially it let 60,000 Jews live. It also ironically transformed Palestine, because it gave a middle-class merchant class in Palestine something that had not been a characteristic of the Yishuv. Enormously controversial to this day, but ended up rescuing more than 1 in 10 Jews in Germany. Only in Germany at that point, because that was the only territory that the Germans had.
Now I'm going to play devil advocate and say, they brought 60,000 German Yekkes to Israel, right? Now, every Yekke that came there created jobs for 4 Polish impoverished Jews, okay? Which means that the population of Palestine, which was about 200,000 before Arlosov, developed into 550,000, without which there wouldn't be a state of Israel. Not only they wouldn't be able to fight the war, but they didn't have healthcare, engineering. I studied in my high school under professors who came from Heidelberg and Berlin, and I and all my generation were lucky enough to experience the most daring and educational experiment in human nature, in human history, being taught by professors who couldn't find a job in academia, and they taught us. And everything that I have today, my love for science, my success in science, not only me, my whole entire generation came from this idea of the German Jews coming to Israel, water supply, health care, okay, education, power, okay. Everything was created on the whole infrastructure of a state on the way. Medina Baderech, yeah, came with this agreement of Arlozov with the Nazis.
Makes you believe in free will, doesn't it? Makes you believe in free will. Sorry, I just thought I'd have to tell people I spoke about free will with Professor Pearl. I just wanted. Rabbi, you have any thoughts on this? You please take it in a different direction if you'd like. But
I don't think you have to worry about me staying in this direction. Although one of my many questions about our mentor, our Rebbe, our leader, Judea Pearl, it's a really interesting relationship. I don't understand. Forget about the contents of the scientific books. I've yet to figure out what the titles of your books in the science realm mean. Yet, I sit here really humbled at a person that we call Rebbe, a leader, a teacher, a mentor. And so I now have at least a fig leaf, Michael, that one of the reasons I cannot understand any of the scientific aspects is you had professors from Heidelberg already in high school, which means for the rest of us, we're starting way back. Look, I'd like maybe to... we can all agree on that. Yeah, I'd like to, as we listen, because Hebrew goes right to left, you see that we're going earlier into history. So one of the many amazing parts, without getting into details about how Balfour and the connection back to Herzl itself was, we say in Hebrew, Lamala min hateva, how that thing came to be. But what's interesting is that in World War I, David Green, i.e. David Ben-Gurion, found himself in Brownsville, New York, in Brooklyn. They say there was even an outdoor debate between him and Lev Bronstein. Leon Trotsky and David Ben-Gurion had a Yiddish outdoor debate about the future of the Jewish people while World War I was raging. Why was he there? Besides obviously trying to raise funds, is because many of the Jewish leaders were afraid that the Ottoman Empire, if it won, would do to the Jews in Palestine what they did to the Armenians. So we talk about this continuum of history and etc. Every single step of the way, of course, has to be analyzed and be given, a logical context. But the truth of the matter is, when I look at that whole train of events, it really is, we say in Hebrew, lamala min hateva, outside the realm of full rational understanding. And since, Professor, you were kind enough to save me by suggesting I go in a different direction, I'm going to take you in a really different direction. So, for me, I was watching Abba Eben's widow talking about those amazing days leading up to the vote. Rabbi Heyer wrote an exhibition about the 18 months. We found out a lot of very interesting things about Truman. We all know the story about why he was going to vote and the battle that he had with probably the most popular American at the time, great war hero, General Marshall, and a great human being. Happened not to particularly like the idea of a Jewish state. He not only bucked the threat, but it turns out he was following much more closely the development of the votes. I guess Truman was the kind of guy who, once he made a commitment, he didn't want to lose. But I'm going to talk about someone else, and you're all welcome to.
Let me only interrupt for one very interesting detail. It's a side story, but a very important story. There was a man working in the State Department by the name of Herbert Fierst. Herbert Fierst was a Yale-Harvard graduate, Yale undergraduate, Harvard graduate, blonde-haired, blue-eyed wasp, except he was a fierce Zionist Jew who never did that. They gave him a document, which was the State Department plan on how to vote on November 29th. It wasn't then November 29th. And they said under no circumstances is this to appear, is this to be told to the Zionists whatsoever. Herb Fierst then turned it over to a man in the White House by the name of David Niles. And Niles went to Truman, and he went to Truman with Clark Clifford. And he essentially said, to put it in the King's English, that the State Department is out to screw you. No matter what decision you make, they're going to be the last one in the conversation with the UN ambassador. And Truman then established a direct line to the ambassador and called the ambassador before the United States voted and said, this is the President of the United States, and this is the way you are to vote, and you are not to take any calls after me. And the people to thank for that are Herb Fierst of blessed memory, David Niles of blessed memory, and Clark Clifford of blessed memory, who went to Harry Truman and made Truman have a direct line, a uninterrupted line, from the Oval Office to Lake Success, New York. And it's one of the ironies of history. And what Rabbi Cooper, Abe, we go back to the old country of Brooklyn. So what Abe said is very important, which is that in essence, George Marshall turned to Harry Truman and said, if you recognize the state of Israel, I will not vote for you in the next election. Marshall was a war hero. Marshall was also the man who came up with the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt all of Europe, transformed the entire thing, and Truman overruled his general. And I believe that it's fair to say that Marshall did not vote for Truman in the 48 election.
So, no, it's that certainly filled out a lot of the details. But the thing that came back to me watching the wonderful clip that you presented is that, and I was born in 1950, so it's in a sense before my time, but we grew up in this milieu, and actually I think the underpinnings of that whole process was to instruct an up-and-coming young generation is that people, not institutions, can change the course of history. Individuals, going into the bathroom, locking the guy in until he says, okay, enough already, I'm going to go out and vote, etc. So what I would just like to suggest by way of furthering our education, because remember, the idea that the United States and the Soviet Union would vote on the same side of the roster on any major world decision was an impossibility. It happened. And people have written books and PhDs as to why. The bottom line that it did. So now, why did China abstain? They were supposed to be voting no. So you might think I'm making it up, and frankly, I know you would check. But go back and Google Two-Gun Cohen. I think an American guy who landed up fleeing, I think, Vancouver, Canada, after he got into a barroom brawl and I think someone got killed. He hopped a freighter. Two-Gun Cohen turned out to be one of the most revered military heroes of both the Chinese nationalists and Mao's communists. He apparently was not just a good barroom brawler. He turned out to be a brilliant general and who was sort of already in retirement, more or less, in 1947. but who was tremendously respected. And if you don't believe me, there's a photo of his matzeva, of where he's buried. It's both in English and I believe in Chinese, that this man turned out to be a great hero. Now, the rumor has it, and the person who did the research is someone I think who did a pretty good job proving it, is that somehow someone figured out, maybe in the Jewish Agency, maybe he was a guy in Temple Sinai here in LA, I have no clue, that there was one man who could stop China from voting against. And his name happened to be Cohen. The Chinese knew he was Jewish. And according to the information, not yet fully verified, is that he called in a chit. And he said, look, China cannot vote against my people. I'm not asking you to vote for, but you can't be on that side of history. Now, we all know that Chairman Mao hated Israel. They were established the same year. Israel tried every which way until that man died. Two people, Chinese and the Jews, have always been an affinity between them during the Shoah and the Shanghai. None of it made a difference. Mao was a virulent anti-Zionist, along with his buddies in Moscow. And yet, you saw that the intervention of one person made a difference. I know a little bit about the Philippines, and if the Japanese had not invaded, the original founder of modern Philippines played poker on Thursday nights, okay, with a guy by the name of MacArthur and his number one lieutenant, a fellow named Eisenhower. And the other partner in this poker game, who was rotational, was one of three Jewish brothers from Cincinnati who owned a tobacco company. How am I doing? Right? And so these three Reformed Jewish brothers, they saw what was going on in Nazi Germany, and they brought up in these games over in Jedemsveld in the Philippines, and actually had a commitment, I think it's Mandalay, they had a commitment from the person who unfortunately, there were some German Jews who made it, but basically all of the things that were set up, imagine that the new Philippines was ready to accept any and all European Jews, even if they came without passports, and they would have been sent to southern Philippines and would have been saved.
By the way, there's Temple Sinai connection to the whole story.
See that?
You all know who Barbie Weinberg is in this synagogue. Bobby Weinberg's father was a major political figure in Indiana, and the ambassador to the Philippines was the former governor of Indiana. And Barbie's father was the person who had him intervene with the Philippine government to get the visas. Again, people can make a difference.
That is really my central point.
And they came from the old country together.
Because it was an impossibility, literally the day after Auschwitz, that suddenly there would be a Jewish state. And of course, we need to know the full flow and all the political ins and outs. But I think the broader message to the new generation coming up was that sense of desperation right after the Shoah, when 6 million Jews were murdered and American Jews understood that whatever they did, it didn't work. That whole attitude, if you want to call it citizenship diplomacy or going outside the box, I think that is an idea whose time, the planting of that seed took place, and shortly thereafter, by historic terms, relatively speaking, in the 1960s, you had a little group called the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry that came about. They held the first protest in front of the Soviet mission in Manhattan. Glenn Richter, an absolute tzaddik, the co-founder, he went to MTA, which was the Yeshiva University's high school. And the day after he ran, I think 40 or 50 students showed up. The day after he ran this first protest, student protest, on behalf of Soviet Jewry, he was called into the principal's office. Now, I'm looking around. Some of you are old enough that you relate to this line. I went to Yeshiva Flatbush in Brooklyn. They always, people who went to Yale and Harvard afterwards. The death knell for any Jewish student was to hear from their principal, this is going to go on your permanent record, and you'll never get into any college. So the reaction of the older generation to the younger generation was, who are you? How do you know that what you're doing here with Two-Gun Cohen or with a protest for Russia, who elected you to do such things? How do you know it's not going to be worse for German Jewry if you make the deal for the 60,000? How do you know that you haven't just made life worse for the Jews of the Soviet Union? And there was no answer to that question. But the response of the older generation to these young people who felt in their gut, we have to do things differently, I find is very much a Jewish DNA. The idea that you have, especially, and maybe combined with the fact that we're lucky enough to be Americans, we have the idea of personal freedoms. But Jewish DNA throughout history demands that whatever station of life you're in, you have an obligation to the klal. You, as an individual, make a difference. And the biggest proof of all, and with this I'll stop, we have the dean of the rabbis of LA here, I don't want to go into it, Russia, is the most pivotal time of the Exodus, right? The Israelites are stuck. The Egyptians are coming to either take them back or kill them all. What does Moses do? He prays. What does God say to Moses? What are you praying for? Get going. Now they're on the lip of the sea. It's got 3 million people. God just told them stop praying. He didn't know what to do. So this guy, Nachshon, I don't know. Medrash doesn't say if he knew how to swim, but Nachshon jumped into the water, and when the water reached his nostrils, that's when God said, okay, we're going to separate the sea, and that's when the miracle started off. So if we talk about these amazing events in 47 and 48, going backwards, Herzl was an Austrian Jew, right? He was 1.5 feet already out.
Hungarian.
But he was Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was basically about to leave the Jewish people, etc. Christmas tree and the whole business. His message resonated with Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia. He didn't even think they were even listening. So I don't think there's ever going to be a straight line in terms of the Jewish experience or Jewish history. What's demanded of each of us is to figure out a way how we can individually do something that will help the klal, that will help the entire people.
Let me just pick up for 1 second on the story that Abe told, because the great Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, the late Emil Fackenheim, said if you want to describe the condition of the Jewish people in one sentence after you know that story, after you know that midrash, he said, welcome my fellow swimmers.
Yeah.
And that is, we have to go in the water without knowing that the sea is going to part, but welcome my fellow swimmers. The other thing, let me point out 2 more things. Number one, the man who later became president of Yeshiva University, when he was a young boy, a man by the name of Rabbi Norman Lamb, who was the prince of the Orthodox establishment, was a gun runner during 46, 47. And his own grandchildren did not know that he was a gun runner.
Czechoslovakia.
A gun runner for Israel.
He was not only a gun runner, he was a young man of science. So after he was finished running that part of the gun running, he was involved in upstate New York, where a number of American Jewish scientists, and maybe some people who escaped, they were trying to figure out how to create cheap explosives that the Jews in the Holy Land could do. So he was not only part of experiments, he was also on the lookout. The feds were after them. I knew Norman Lamb Zatzal from the time I was 14 years old. The last guy on the planet you would ever predict would be involved in any kind of behavior like that was Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb. And that's exactly what he did. And it explains why, in our time, he was so emotionally connected to young Jews who stood up for Soviet Jewry. It connected back to what he was, but in a
I think, if I may interject two cases which I know about, okay, one of the reasons that we are commemorating the November 29 event is to reinforce and to remember the sacrifice or the daring attitude of the ordinary heroes that risked things in their life in order to, because they saw the call of history and they felt that this is their time to contribute and to respond to that call. And I want to mention two. One of them is very well known, and this is Eddie Jacobson, okay? Which, of course, and we should learn from here, because he was Harry Truman business partner, former business partners in Missouri, okay? And he called Harry Truman on October 3rd of 1947, just before the vote, and he said, Harry, my people need help, and I want you to help them. And Truman answered him evasively and said, Eddie, when you come to Washington, I'll explain to you why things are not that simple as you think. And he called him back and he said, Harry, my people need help, and I want you to help them, because Weizmann needed one more audience with Truman in order to convince him that. Now, the point is that here is Eddie Jacobson risking his friendship with Truman, knowing that Truman will tell his wife, these pushy Jews, I can't stand them.
Call him a son of a bitch.
A son of a bitch, right? And he said,
The mic is not on.
pushy, no pushy, history calls me, and this is what I have to do. And now I want to mention another fellow, unknown. His name is Albert Einstein, okay? Who happened to have some friendship with Nehru, who was the then Prime Minister of India. And for Nehru, Zionism was a no-no, because they just got rid of the British there, and every movement that smelled of colonialism was a no-no to the Indians. And here is Weitz, and here is Einstein, not risking much, because he was more famous than Nehru at that time, but still, I tell you what he risked. And he gives Nehru a long lecture about Zionism and why the Jewish people deserve this exception, and pleaded with him to vote yes, because when push comes to shove, the Jewish needs is greater than other people's need, and he will be remembered in the August Court of Justice. That's how he put it. Now, what did Albert Einstein risk at that time? He risked what my colleagues today in a university are not only risking, but are scared to risk. This is the professional standing and the criticism. What does he know about politics? He's a scientist, right? What does he get involved with the politics? It's exactly what deters my colleagues today. And we are in a critical state to take a stand and say, enough is enough. Okay? I'm a Zionist. Most of them shy from that kind of standing. Most of them do not recognize the call of the hour.
No backbone. Before we close, thank you very much. We could go on, talk about this, because this is an issue that we feel very strongly about. I celebrate November 29th because today, 65 years ago, when I was 8 years old, we crossed the border into Austria from Hungary, and we escaped with my parents and I. Wow. So November 29th. Just so happens.
And for those of you who don't understand that, that's the 56th revolution. The 56th revolution was the foreshadowing of what then occurred in 68.
That's right.
And then what occurred in 89. And that has implications for the world in which we live.
I would like to add one more anecdote. We crossed into Austria. This is November 29th. November 30th comes, we take a train into Vienna. My father spoke perfect German. He went to the Technische Hochschule in Wien in the 20s because Jews were not allowed to study in Budapest. And then my father made Aliyah to Palestine in 1933, and he lived there for 4 years. And he lived in Haifa. And when we arrived to Austria, my mother spoke only Hungarian. And I spoke Hungarian, obviously. And my mother said to him, says, well, where are we going from here? She said, we're going to America. Why are we going to America? Vienna's very nice. The Russians can come anytime. My father was very politically astute. She says, well, why don't we go to Israel? You liked it there when you lived there when it was Palestine. You said you felt like it was your home. Why don't we go to Israel? He says, the Arabs will never allow the Jews to live in peace. And that's how we came to America. And unfortunately, as good as things are, we still have the devil on our backs. We've got Iran. And all this friendliness with the UAE and all this Bahrain, all this Chochmetz, I wouldn't give a nickel for it. I think we still only survive in Israel because we have those soldiers, because we have every 18-year-old in the army, and all the girls are in the army. If it wasn't for that, we're screwed. Toda rabah. Chag Sameach.
Thanks for having us.
Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friends.
To this day, when the Chinese ambassador comes to England, his first stop is at the grave of Cohen.
Yeah, every time.
Every
He's
time.
a national hero.
He's a national hero. Before they meet the...
Two-gun Cohen. Look him up tonight. Imagine I taught.
Maybe that's why
Dr. Pearl, I taught Dr. Pearl something. Leila Dvar Torah. Okay.
Maybe that's why China. No, maybe that's why China's doing a lot of business in Israel.